Hi everyone. Welcome to Songs of Songs, A Bird's Eye View by Ellen Messer. This one is the inclusion of Songs of Songs in the biblical canon and Jewish liturgy has an engaging history to replenish with delightful commentary on its natural and cultural theology and elements. So I hope you enjoy, and of course, feel free to enter any questions or anything in the chat. Happy to help with anything needed, but I will let Ellen take it away from here. Happy Shavuot, everybody.
Okay. Anyway, welcome. I'm going to start out by chanting the first three verses of Shir HaShirim, and then we'll enter into additional conversation. And I do plan to allow time at the end so people can ask questions, add comments, and I'll keep moving back and forth between the screen share and the chat. אני הבצלת השרון, שושנת העמקים, כשושנה בין החוכים, כן רעייתי בין הבנות, כתפוח בצי היער, כן דודי בין הבנים, בצילו כימדתי וישבתי, פריו מתוק להיקי. So these are the first three verses in chapter 2, according to the standard version that's published in the old JPS version, translation and interpretation of the 5 Megillot. And we will be listening to additional verses throughout this time, but I want to welcome you to what I see somebody, you're going to let people in from the waiting room, I hope. Yeah. I will be going through a couple of my own sort of personal connections with this text and with its chanting. I'll then be going through a brief session on the positioning and history of the text. We'll look at some of the translations and interpretations, in particular the bird imagery and song, and then I'll give you my own kind of reflections on Song of Songs. So traditionally, Song of Songs is not sung for Shavuot, it's chanted the Shabbat of Pesach. It's one of the two scrolls of love that very happily was produced in a single book that was written with essays submitted by many people that I know who are female Jewish commentators on Song of Songs and also on the Book of Ruth. And I'm very glad that this particular volume, and I'm going to be giving you references to different sources, exists because it kind of gives a rationale for why I'm talking about this on Shavuot. My own personal history with this is that about 40 years ago at the Worship and Study Minyan at Harvard, there was a friend of mine who was chanting chapter 2 of Song of Songs, and she was about to move to California or Colorado somewhere, and she said, "Why don't you do this? You can do this." And so I got in touch with Judith Cates, who just retired as a professor of Bible, Torah, and rabbinics at Hebrew College, and she made me a tape, and I learned to chant Song of Songs from the tape. And for the next decades, I standardly on Shabbat Passover chanted Song of Songs. Fast forward to the 2000s, I was in Washington, D.C. on a multi-year job, and I had joined Temple Micah, a Reform synagogue, very progressive synagogue on Wisconsin Avenue in D.C. And all of us there would volunteer things that we could contribute to the synagogue. And one of the things that I figured I could contribute would be to do a program on Song of Songs. So during Shabbat Passover, one of those years, I prepared a very short program on Song of Songs about the length of a sermon. And then I came back to Boston where I continued to chant this section, except this year I did not. And that's because I was attending services, Shabbat services regularly at Temple Israel. And when there was a request for people to volunteer to lead sessions for this tikkun, I volunteered two topics. One of them was to discuss what is my professional specialty, which is the use of food as a weapon and looking at humanitarian law in international law and Jewish perspectives. That was topic one. And the second was to prepare something on Song of Songs. And the organizers chose Song of Songs. So here we are. And I thank you all for being here. And I hope it's an engaging session. I look forward to your comments. So that's my brief history with this. I actually added a lot for this session, looking at many of the works that have been published in translation and interpretation of Song of Songs since the early 2000s, when I last produced a short sermon on this topic. So we'll be looking also then at the position and history, translations and interpretations, bird imagery and song, and then additional reflections. So Song of Songs is a very sensuous, kind of deeply moving, very emotional love poetry. It's a whole series of love poetry. It was divided in the 13th century. A Christian Benedictine divided the song into 8 chapters, which is what we look at today. Although poets take very different views on where the division should be. Most poets do not consider this a single poem, although it is treated like a single poem in liturgy. Instead, they come up with different divisions. They see the sections differently. And as an example, the liturgist poet Marcia Fox sees 31 different sections in this particular poem and this particular song, and we'll be talking about some of those issues. It's a rather unusual text for liturgical text for the canon, for the official sacred literature of Judaism and also then of Christianity. It's unusual because it includes multiple voices, and the predominant voice is that of a female, and that's very unusual in our sacred literature. Second, it's very, very sensuous language, lots of very, very beautiful descriptions of nature, of seasonality, of love, of longing, of actual erotic sexual feelings. And there's absolutely no mention of God. So that's another reason why there are some questions about why is this in the liturgy. As we consider the history of this work, kind of positioning it, it became associated with King Solomon, along with Ecclesiastes, and also and other songs, lamentations. The 3 of them were considered to be songs of Solomon, and that was one of the reasons that this was considered to be sacred text. But it's also the case when there were certain questions about this kind of sensuous language and material and no mention of God and a women's voice predominant, there were rabbis who questioned whether this should be part of the official canon. It obviously was already part of the official canon when the final text for Tanakh was being canonized. And the staunchest and most devoted, dedicated advocate for keeping it in the canon was Rabbi Akiba, who considered it to be the most essential, the most sacred of the sacred texts. And anyone who would say otherwise was simply discarding that which was most wonderful and beautiful in this. Yet at the same time, one of the things that was apparently going on as well, which we know from the rabbi's comments, was that there were certain sections of Song of Songs that were drinking songs that were kind of just sort of chanted, sung in taverns, and the rabbis strongly condemned that. And it was also the case that parts of certain verses in Song of Songs, Dodi Li, My Beloved is Mine, this was certainly part of the festivals of courting that went on in certain times of the year that were official. So that was there as well. So we do know that this has a very long, Song of Songs has a very long history. This is just a summary of the controversies, no God language, women's voices, lots of sensuous language. These were all concerns and controversies, and yet it was very much accepted. The date in which the Song of Songs is considered to have been finalized in its text was during the Hellenistic period, probably 3rd century BCE. But what we know from the analyses of the source materials is that many of the sections of the song go back much, much before that, that there is certainly very ample lifting from the surrounding Canaanite cultures, from Sumerian, Akkadian, the Babylonian realm, from Egypt, and some of the analysts also say that materials come from as far afield as South Asia. So there's a lot of material here. And what's absolutely brilliant in sort of reading about these materials is to see how our ancient liturgists took these materials from the surrounding cultures and they turned it into sacred Jewish literature, how they adapted these texts so that the texts, in fact, vary significantly from their source material, although the source material can be very clearly and productively compared. In the Jewish text, there's absolutely no mention of kind of sacred marriage or any of the rites, sacred rites from which the materials may have come. The woman's voice and some of the symbolism, including the dove symbolism, we'll be going into more in greater depth as we move on. Probably comes from the rituals and the language surrounding adoration of love goddesses and the sacred marriage ceremonies of some of the surrounding cults. None of this carries over into the Jewish text, although we can certainly compare the surrounding cultural cultic literatures. There's no mention, it's a very, some of the poets describe the Jewish text as being actually beautifully delicate in the sense that the surrounding fertility rituals, the fertility goddesses, their symbolism, all of it contains very explicit sexual language, reproductive language. The Jewish language in our text doesn't have any mention of genitalia. That's considered to be completely taboo in the Jewish text. And it's altogether just a fascinating account of the relationships, the erotic sexual relationships between human beings, between male and female, and also really beautiful descriptions of the natural world and the colors, the scents, the sights, the sounds, the smells. All of these really are very effectively carried over into these texts. And this is what we'll be looking at in a little greater depth as we go on. So this is one of the 5 scrolls that are associated with the Jewish festivals. It has, as I said, historically, it was supposed to be ascribed to Solomon, which is one of the factors that would make it sacred. The historical language suggests that indeed that was around the period in the 10th century BCE when some of the text was finalized. But the placement of the text has varied over time. So sometimes it's presented with the other writings, sometimes it's presented sometimes it's presented mainly with the other scrolls. We're not going to go into that in any greater depth, but point is there has been some manipulation of the way in which the text fits in. But we're really interested in the language of this text and what could be its spiritual meaning, what could be additional meanings for Jewish purposes, and you can sort of have fun with this as we go through it. As I mentioned, I learned to chant the text from a tape, but I've been going through many of the different translations. As our rabbis always tell us in our congregations, every translation is an interpretation, and that's certainly what I experienced as I went through this. So what I'm going to do here then is go through very quickly some of these translations and interpretations. I'll chant a little bit more from chapter 2 of Song of Songs, which is the chapter that I originally learned and which I find that just the nature, the seasonal symbolism just so powerful. And then I'm going to add the additional interpretations by certain rabbinic authorities, by poets and liturgists, and then give you some of my my own sort of reflections on this text. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a cantor. I do sing in choir, in congregational choirs, but I am an anthropologist. And so what we'll do at the end is I'll just give you kind of an analysis, a very, very quick couple of sentence analysis from an anthropological standpoint, and we'll see how you accept that as being valuable for you. So the first place I want to start is kind of talking a little bit more about the translations and interpretations and the various levels of meanings. If you come from traditional Jewish background, what you know is that you have the Peshat, you have the plain sense of the text, you then have various levels of allegorical interpretations and additional commentaries. And you can find all of that if you're interested in those levels of interpretation. The JPS has produced a revised translation and commentary by Michael Fishbane. And I suggest that if that's where you want to be, you should look at Michael Fishbane's text. Michael Fishbane's text is also very carefully quoted by the most recent traditional text translation and interpretation, which is by Adele Berlin. We'll look a little bit more at her work, but I'm not going to treat that anymore here. Instead, what I do is I adopt the four levels of meaning that were presented and which I find very satisfying to use by Gunther Plaut, who offered the Torah as a chumash for congregations. That's been revised once, but we're going to look at the literal meanings, and those will be a lot of the language of nature, of sexual arousal. Those would be the literal meanings. We can look at the cross-cultural meanings in their times. I've already mentioned some of those, which is the fertility rituals, the sacred marriage rituals, the enactments there from different cultures. We'll consider very briefly rabbinic and historical meanings. These are not literal meanings. Instead, what they're doing is making the text serve them as a way to think about the relationship of love between Israel and God. And there are later historical relationships also where Christians took that same approach to allegory, and they considered the relationship between Jesus Christ and the church, the Christian church. So they basically took the same allegorical approach. And then we'll look very briefly at implications for our time and open this up for discussion. So the literal meanings and some of the cross-cultural interpretations, I find, again, I'm giving you a number of sources here. I find this very long work, it's almost 800 pages, by Marvin Pope, who is a professor of ancient Near Eastern languages and literatures, a Bible, associated for many, many years at Yale University. And he produced this kind of mammoth text, the Anchor Bible series on Song of Songs, with his new translation and commentary. So Pope is someone who took this text. He had enormous knowledge of ancient Near Eastern and languages and cultures, and he considered the many, many references in Ugaritic, in Sumerian, in Akkadian, in Egyptian, and he's the one that really carries the analysis eastward to consider how this text, in fact, also seems to borrow from going east from the Arabian Peninsula to trade routes in South Asia and Indian erotic ritual literature. So he brings all of those perspectives in as some of the source materials for these texts. What's also really interesting, so this is love poetry, but what's also really interesting is that Pope became really fascinated with the idea that there's a lot of imagery of death. So he's looking also at love and death, and very controversially, but he brings up all of his sources, lots of really good illustrations, considering how love can be stronger than death, and goes further there. He is the person most often cited by the later commentaries right through 2025 because it is a very thorough treatment. And as you can see there, it's got some really nice creative illustrations, and he does provide very firm grounding for his particular translations and others. I just chanted the first 3 verses of chapter 2 of Song of Songs. One of the aspects of going through translations from different authorities is that they're really taking very seriously what the nature context is. So they're not only looking at the explicit sexual language, they're also looking at the natural context. So if you read the standard old 1969 JPS translation, it starts out, I'm a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys, like a lily among thorns. So is my darling among the maidens. Like an apple tree among trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the youths. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my mouth. What's fascinating there, going through the translations, is that the language allows for various translations to look at what might be the different flowers. What are they actually talking? Which flowers are they actually talking about? Is it really a rose? Are they talking about a valley, a rose of Sharon for that part, that lily in that part of the valley? Pope translates, for example, rose. He calls it a crocus. He talks about the forms of the crocus, how the crocus might, or these bulbous plants and flowers might appear in the east. All of this enters in. So it's really very powerful to look at the way in which the language works. It's also very powerful in the sense that the poet's analysis of this is that there are actually multiple voices just in these 3 verses. So the first verse is the woman sort of coquettishly flirting with her male would-be lover. The second verse is the male lover flirting with the woman. The third verse is the woman again flirting with the male. And what's fascinating in this is that the poets look at this not only from the point of view of the language, what are the flowers, what's the context, is it a lily among thorns, or are there actual or the actual fields filled with thistles, and there are other flowers among the thistles? Is there an apple tree among the trees? Well, were there apples in ancient Israel? Some say yes, some say no. Some translate it as apricots, some say apricots weren't there. Some would prefer to see other possible fruits, quince, but they're really recognizing that these are very beautiful verses that are talking about the springtime in the land of Israel in ancient times, with all of its emergent flowers and fruits, and also beautiful animals. There's great beauty here. And this emphasis on beauty, on nature, on the liveliness of nature goes along with the erotic poetry of the exchange between the males and females. One of the other aspects of this first part is also the poets are able to show how this is a particular poetry form where there's kind of a word game between person one, in this case the female, and person two, who's the male, and they're kind of competing with each other to talk about, who's got a better view of what's going on. So this is kind of the literal meaning. It's also looking at some of the cross-cultural aspects that relate to the natural world and also the cultural role around them. So what did the rabbis do with this? How did they think about this? And what they did was they converted this into a really powerful dialogue between Israel and God. That this was considered to be the very beautiful, emotional relationship, the loving relationship between God and Israel, reciprocal, and feeling all of those emotions. And there's usually a very explicit divide between those, and particularly the modern poets, who see the literal meanings as really being primary, and the philosophers who make wonderful, wonderful commentaries on the commentaries that were written in the rabbinic period, moving forward through the medieval times, looking at all the ways in which the rabbis manipulated the text to make it a text that would speak to them in the allegorical terms of the way in which the souls of Israel, of the individual Israelites, the rabbis themselves, would be yearning for God. So this becomes then not a sexual yearning, but it becomes a really emotional, soul-filled yearning to be close to God. And uh, um, the person who's dealt, I think, most effectively with this, looking at this transformation, looking at how it works, looking at how it relates to all the other texts, is my esteemed early teacher who recorded Song of Songs for me, um, Judith Cates, who wrote the essay in the volume of collected essays, Scrolls of Love, Ruth, and the Song of Songs, Entering the Holy of Holies, Rabbinic Midrash, and the Language of Intimacy in Scrolls of Love, in this book, Scrolls of Love. And I've just sort of transferred here what I see as really a very powerful statement of what's going on, as she, with great skill and with meticulous detail, takes the way the rabbis thought about these texts, used these texts, and used their skills of relating texts one to another. So taking lines of Torah, taking lines of the prophets, taking lines from other writings, and relating them all to create a story of spiritual beauty as Israel interacts with God through the covenant and through this relationship of love. And this is how the rabbis were able to, in fact, transcend the literal, what could be viewed as the literal, eroticism of the text, and make it into a text that was superbly sacred. And read this, the Song of Songs allowed the rabbis to read the history of Israel as, and I'm just going to take us away, as a love story, to read the Torah as a dialogue of love between God and human beings. They enlisted the passionate energy, the sensual specificity and richness, and the erotic power of the song's language into their quest to articulate their deepest and most intimate knowledge of relationship. And again, this is all through the traditional methods of using, text citing. They thus unveil a relationship of mutuality expressed in need and desire, but also in fulfillment, moments of fulfillment in the past, hopes of permanence in the future. In the Midrash, erotic language is religious, religious language is erotic. And we'll have a chance to think about this some more as we go through this. And I pose the question, which I will be looking at throughout the rest of this presentation. Do they have to be one or the other? Or is it possible that the two reinforce each other? Okay. Moving forward in history, then we can consider sort of how this text might have been considered by Maimonides. And for me, it's always a case that I go to my old paperback copy of The Guide to the Perplexed, to whether or not it's a great translation. There's more recent translations, but I always find it meaningful, even though the language is somewhat archaic. And I think these sentences kind of capture the way Maimonides thought about the way in which the song fit into his understanding of achieving relationship, a perfect knowledge of God, which for him was love. Think about it, for him, if he's thinking about love, he's thinking about the song and what it's saying. And this was a sentence I pulled out. When we are in that state, which the song on the relationship between God and man, remember this is the way in which the rabbis had interpreted this, poetically describes in the following words, and this is a sentence from Song of Songs: I sleep, but my heart waketh. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh. Then we have attained not only the height of the ordinary prophets, but of Moses, our teacher, and come close to God. And this is in one of the last sections of the book, how the perfect worship God. And Maimonides is someone who's continually searching for a way to sort of remove all the extraneous thoughts from his mind at any particular point in time, and trying to figure out how does one become closer to God by really pushing out all the material aspects of the home, of food, of work, of family relationships, of sex, all of that. In his sense, the language, whether interpreted through the symbols of the senses or theology, helps elevate one to this higher state of purpose, understanding, or if he writes elsewhere, to love of God, which is his. So any of you who've been wondering, what does it mean? He's always asking, what does it mean to love God? And to love God is to reach this state of understanding and knowledge where one is using all of one's faculties to appreciate not only the natural world around one, but also appreciate the actual faculty of the intellect that allows him to manipulate various ways of understanding the world, various philosophies, various theologies, to put them together so that he can view that he has reached a higher state of understanding, which he calls love. And I take this point of view not only directly from the text, but I also take it from certain analyses of the text. Let me move that back. I'm once again trying to move us out of the way. But in the 1970s, Rabbi Leonard S. Kravitz, who was teaching at Hebrew Union College and had also been my childhood rabbi, huge influence on me, he published what was essentially a précis of what would be his later book on Shir HaShirim, and he entitles his article, what's the secret of the guide to the perplexed by Maimonides? He said it's really there hiding in plain sight. And what he means by that is that Maimonides is really talking about the great gift of God and relationship with God, which is the human intellect. And so this is also the message in this very recent posting by Menachem Kellner in Torah.com, Song of Songs, A Secret for Maimonides, an open book for Gersonides. And again, it's a reference, and I'll send these references to the hosts of this tikkun if you're interested in kind of looking at them in one place. But it's the way in which he looks at, he really takes the same kind of idea, although without any references to it, of understanding how Maimonides is making the Song of Songs, something that you sort of keep quietly away, but he's thinking very carefully about the way in which he can very carefully entertain all these different modes of thought without in any way threatening people's respect for his deep Jewish learning and commitment. So that's part of the secret. So there are then these many meanings, and I put here an image of Song of Songs, the most recent volume of interpretation, which was translated, commented, edited by Adele Berlin in a couple of months, issued a couple of months ago, 2025. And she basically covers these literal, cross-cultural, rabbinic, and historical things, and she considers what's going on in our time. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly take a break here and see whether we have any comments. And Andrew Overstein, you've got a puzzled look on your face. What are you thinking?
Oh, Ellen, I'm sorry. Do you want me to give them the ability to unmute now?
Sure.
All right. If anyone has any questions or would like to unmute, you have the ability
Yeah,
now.
because I don't see too many.
Puzzled, Ellen, just fascinated by your scholarship and grateful for your insights and the way that you're framing this in such a comprehensive fashion. So just grateful for your teaching.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments here? Okay, so I'll go back to screen sharing because
So
there's
actually,
Yeah.
I had a comment and a question. So one, when you were talking about sort of the eroticism of it and the question of can it be erotic and holy, like can it be about both or not be about both? I mean, it's not our tradition, but I thought a lot about nuns in the Middle Ages who wrote this very like erotic poetry that was also holy. So I think that maybe it's just a longer tradition that, that we have as well. And then my question was, you mentioned that this was part of courtship rituals, or there's evidence to suggest it was part of courtship rituals. When did those kind of fall out of fashion, or when did it fall out of fashion for that?
I have no idea. I just know that I remember, I hear, I remember hearing at Yom Kippur that, after Yom Kippur, at our traditional services, that after Yom Kippur, this was a place where the maidens would go out, they'd be dressed in white. They'd be dressed in white, they'd, be signaling their beloveds, or their hopeful potential beloveds, and singing some of the verses here. But that's all I know, and I don't know when that ended. But it's a good question. Thank you. And on your other issue, you're very, very astute, and learned to know that that the Song of Songs as a text was extremely important in the monastic communities of Christians. In fact, they said that when there were monastic community, some of the sources I read said that the monastic communities made this really the one text that they always had with them. We're always reading, and it's just a really interesting aspect of thinking about the way in which love, the erotic love, somehow elevates one to be thinking about love of God. It's a very, very interesting proposition. Okay, so I'm going to move on because we're going to run out of time pretty soon. Yeah, okay, so we're back. So these are some images of doves. We're going to talk a little bit about doves, and they were images that are in I think they're in Marcia Falk's treatment of Song of Songs. What you can see, there are several references in Song of Songs to doves' eyes. You can see that they're very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. You can imagine that they may have fluttering eyelids. These are all aspects of the dove that go along with the symbolism of the dove, which is the symbolism of gentleness, the symbolism of really of kind of kindness, of beauty. If someone is feeling stressed, they kind of remove the stress, they make one feel better. And these images were produced along with many other images, including images of flowers, by the artist Barry Moser. So let me just chant a little bit more from Song of Songs, so you'll get a bit more of the flavor here of how I'm dealing with this. And what I want you to do is to listen for the bird imagery. So there'll be bird imagery from doves in two places. One of them actually calls it my dove, and the other is language that's not particularly related, but the way in which I chant this, it actually to me, it sounds like dove. So I'll start out with verse 7. השבעתי אתכם בנות ירושלים בצבאות, בעלות השדה, אם תהירו ואם תראו. את החווה עד שתחפץ. So you can, to me, that's like a cooing of a dove. Very, very gentle, very nice. Then there's some more attention to the beloved. There's a comparison. The female's making the comparison to the beloved, jumping like a gazelle or a young stag. And then the male is looking up at the female, house a little bit out of reach, and he says, you're peering through the lattice. It's like a dove, in the rocks, in the crevice of the rocks. So I'm going to chant a little bit more, starting with verse 10. Anadoti v'omar li kubilach, rayati fati ulchilach, ki hine hastar avar hageshem alav halach lo. So that's saying the winter, the rains, the winds, they're gone. You can see that, the hageshem, you can hear that there. So that's there also. And then the next sentence begins, Yonati, בחגבי הסלע, בסתר המדרגה, הריני את המעריך, הריני את מורך, השמיעיני את קולך, כי קולך ערב ומערך נאווה. And for me, in addition to the tiru, the yonati, to me that's real dove sound. That's real dove sound, and yonati, that's actually referring to doves in the language. So let's see what else goes on here. So here we have some poets, and these are the recent poets who've been translating and commenting. The Song of Songs, world's first great love poem by Hannah Bloch and Ariel Bloch. This is a whole book. They had an essay also in the Songs of Love. Look, winter is over, the rains are done, wildflowers spring up in the fields. These are very free translations. Now, but here's the important thing about doves. Now is the time of the nightingale. In every meadow you hear the song of the turtle dove. My dove is in the clefts of the rock. So what these poets are doing is they're looking at the seasonality, that there are actually multiple birds that pass through the land of Israel right at the beginning of spring when the winds and the rains are over, and they're mating and they're singing. And some poets prefer to take the term, now is the time of the nightingale. They're saying not dove, they're not saying turtle dove, they're saying nightingale. In every meadow, you heard the song of the turtle dove. The turtle dove is a different species from other doves, and it's known to mostly pass through the land of Israel. It doesn't usually stay there to actually nest. It will mate there, and then it'll move on. The dove, however, the rock dove, is in the clefts of the rocks. There's a lot of attention here to the springtime, to the bursting forth in fertility, and also to the different species that are there. The next poet, Marcia Folks, who published her view and her translation in 1990, she takes quite a slightly different perspective. She lets us have, in some sense, generic birds wing in the low sky. She mentions the dove and the songbird. You can figure that might be the nightingale singing in the open air above. One of the problems with the text in terms of trying to figure out what's going on is that words in Hebrew have many different meanings, many different senses. So, for example, the Hebrew says, the time of Zamir. So what's Zamir? Well, time of singing. The birds are singing, time Zamir. But Zamir can also mean pruning. So the commentators have spent a huge amount of time talking about, well, is pruning out of season here? What season are we talking about? Is it really singing? Is it pruning? But all of it allows really the exercise of thinking about the natural world and the way in which all of this can really elevate the senses and also the appreciation of time, the appreciation of the cycles of nature, this appreciation of the reproductive lines. All of this is really quite beautiful. And we can imagine that the rabbis who are poring over the Hebrew are thinking about all of these things. So artists have helped to present some of these things. If you wonder why the dove is such an important symbol, it's because it's really beautiful. And there are multiple references to your eyes are doves, both for the female to the male and the male to the female. You're beautiful, your eyes are doves. And here you can say that one of the reasons the eyes are doves, that they're almond-shaped eyes. That could be one reason. Could also be that the dove has a little circle around it, so it could be like the kohl, like the makeup that they use there, but it's just all really very beautiful. And you can view this as beautiful or not, but doves are clearly a very important symbol, Song of Songs, in many other, this is Chagall, but there are many, many other artists. But what I want to do before we run out of time is just sort of tell you, where I'm thinking, how I've been thinking about all of this, my personal reflections and meanings. So as I've mentioned, I've always been quite attached to the Guide for the Perplexed. I find it's a text I can go back to over and over again and really enjoy getting into the thought patterns of Maimonides. The secrets hiding in plain sight, why this was so important for him. But clearly, he found this truly uplifting as he was thinking about ways to become closer to God. And this was also the understanding, as I said, of my childhood rabbi, Rabbi Leonard S. Kravitz, Maimonides' understanding of all the ways texts offering Jewish guidance help work. And what's also significant in these final chapters of Maimonides is he talks about so much that we don't understand in Tanakh, so much that's esoteric. And yet he says, when we're told to do things that don't seem to make any sense, it contributes to our just being very much aware of all of the grandeur and the things going on in the world of nature, all of God's gifts. And then he connects it all to what he sees as the basic purpose of law, which is to teach everyone to live better and contribute to a better society, and to really work against injustice. So we can think about that. If we had another half hour, we could talk more about how can we get from the Song of Songs to a pattern of Jewish ritual, of Jewish life that helps us, that helps everyone work against injustice. How do these work together? Maimonides gives us some guidance on how to do this. I also am just a great proponent of Emil Fackenheim, who one year when I was in Washington, I was too tired after teaching summer school in the evening to actually think about driving to a tikkun. Those days was pre-Zoom. And I was looking at several of Fackenheim's texts. And Fackenheim's really important because he was someone who argued a child of a Holocaust survivor. He's someone who argued against the death of God people. Really very, very important person. And his basic point is that the truth of the Exodus and the truth of the revelation at Sinai, these revelations of God and all of the texts that go around with them are really significant for Jewish survival. And as long as there are people who affirm that we went forth from Egypt and we received the law at Sinai, as long as these are committed statements by people, by Jews, then Judaism is alive and will continue to survive. And I see the additional texts, the Ketuvim, really as being connected to this as well. That the language, the uplifting of the language, is really important. So then, let me just take you very briefly to Victor Turner, who's a very, very, very important anthropologist, symbolic analysis of ritual, of society. And he has the concept of multivocalic symbols. And multivocalic symbols means that symbols, whether we're going to talk about the dove, whether we're going to talk about certain flowers, but he points out, or whether we're going to talk about basic symbols of sexual emotions, he says symbols point in many directions. And he was in Africa looking at symbols like wuji trees that had white latex. It could symbolize mother's milk, or it could symbolize male semen. The mother's milk also made people reflect on matrilineal, which was a principle of society, and the aspects of patrilineal that were in there. What he was saying was that symbols have many, many different voices, and they point in many directions. And the directions can be sensory, and we have in the Song of Songs interpretations of the sensory. The directions can be theological, ideological, social, institutional. That would be the way in which the rabbis were talking about relationships of love between Israel and God. And they can also be emotional, covering all of the above. And I find this really a key to what's going on here and what's really missing in most of the interpretations I read. Because the poets are very concerned with reading the poetry out loud, to really feeling and hearing the language of the shir, of the song. That's terrific. But what they're not talking about is the kind of chanting that I experience, thinking about Yonah, and what does the dove mean in terms of all of this seasonal symbolism and the beauty of the animal and its mating, and how does this all work? And the rabbis and their analysts and the people who were analyzing the rabbinic statements they're concerned with whether it's allegory or sensory and sensual. And I'm saying, well, it's not an either or issue. Interpretations of love poetry in this spring into harvest seasons, the reflections on this full range of sensory and intellectual faculties of human beings and intersections with nature and the divine in Jewish history and lives. All of this really comes together. I mean, if you take the Victor Turner's point about the multivocalic symbols, we see this all coming together in Song of Songs and its continuing repeated power in each ages for different types of people. The poets, the historians, the linguists, the philosophers, the theologians, the singers, the anthropologists, any and all of us. We don't have to choose one, the allegorical or the sensory. They all help to elevate us. And for me, returning to Maimonides, I think just about the grandeur, the tremendous grandeur and power of our tradition, that by learning about Song of Songs, by chanting this beautiful poetry and musical dimensions of Song of Songs, by doing all this, what I'm doing is helping to affirm my own connection to my ongoing tradition, which I use to fight injustice. So thank you very much for your attention. I think we're out of time. And I wish you a time of beautiful learning as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was, oh, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I just wanted to
Okay,
say,
great.
I'm
I just wanted to make sure.
I'm also just looking at the chat, and certainly the dove is a symbol also of peace. So
Amazing. Thank you so much.
peace and love.
Um,
What could be more?
Yeah, absolutely. That was great. Thank you so much for that insightful learning. I appreciate your time, and I know I'm sure I speak for everyone that was awesome.